also a host species of Asian longhorn beetle, so you wouldn't be able to move ash out of Worcester if you wanted to. The good news about Asian longhorn is that they're invasive, they're native to that area, so the Manchurian ash they typically feed on has co-evolved with them. They don't have any issues with them. They have their own natural predators, but of course, once they're taken out of this environment and found someplace else, that's when all havoc starts to really take loose. So where do we first find them outside of China? When was the first issue where we really had a problem? And that, of course, was southeast Michigan. So southeast Michigan was kind of ground zero for EAB, right on the border with Canada. And what would happen is that you had these huge natural stands of ash. And for years and years, people started to see the decline get really severe until they actually would bring in entomologists to do an assessment and say, hey, what do you guys think is happening here? And that's when it was determined that emerald ash borer had really started to take footing and develop an infestation. That's one of the things really important when it comes to invasive insects and a lot of invasive species, is that sometimes, more often than not, they really establish themselves before we start to notice them. And that's something to keep a note of, because if you can catch an infestation early on, you've got a much better likelihood of actually controlling it or mitigating any impacts. So one of the problems about emerald ash borer, and we'll talk about how this is that it is the fastest spreading pest we've ever seen in North America. Nothing has gotten further faster. And it's also the most destructive pest we've seen in North America. Nothing has killed more trees in less time. So as we sit here and talk about this today, tens and millions of ash trees have been killed, and this costs billions of dollars in damages, and that's just the United States alone. I mean, Canada has their own programs as well. And I want you to think about that as far as the future, because what that means is that we don't know what the future of that genus, the Fraxinus genus, is. We don't know if we'll be able to see ash trees in our future for our kids or our grandkids. If you go to a nursery right now and you decide you want to plant a black ash on your front lawn, you can't buy one. You know, and that's something that's kind of interesting to note, because apart from all the great ecosystem services and all the practical economic services that trees have, the trees have inherent value, right? Ash trees have a right to exist, and that's something that we have to consider as far as the state of the forest in the United States. So how exactly did it get here? You guys probably know the story. It's all too familiar, but it's thought to have been introduced via shipments of tainted wood packaging material, so pallets, crates, things like that. Same kind of story with the Asian longhorn beetle, also known as ALB. It's important to note that ever since the discovery of this being a pathway, they have now passed regulations where pallets and wood chip material has to be stamped and to verify that it's been either heat treated or chemical treated, heat treated being preferable of the two. But this is really how the major culprit and how it gets here. As you can imagine, the wood boring pest has this larval stage and pupation stage inside of wood. So you've got the bug inside these crates here, they transport over the United States, they emerge as adults, and boom, now we've got a major infestation. Like anything, there's a lot of challenges with international trade and shipping. It's impossible to really kind of regulate everything. We do have people at the border that are checking that all the time, and they're looking for signs of EAB, but again, it's not easy. So where exactly is EAB today? I actually have to update the slide. I just realized there's 31 states. Anybody know what the most recent state is that we just talked about not too long ago? It's up in Vermont, exactly right. And Vermont, for the longest time, was kind of like the last bastions where those of us that are doing this kind of work knew it was probably there, but it was nice to see the map be blank. We just had this kind of nice notion of it not being in the area, but not too long ago it was confirmed in Vermont, which is quite sad. Something that the state officials there are now kind of spurring into action to really make sure they get management plans going. So what is the real culprit here? And this is something that we know, but again, it's important to reiterate. It's not the natural spread of the bug. It can fly about a mile or two each day. It gets up in the headwinds, maybe two or three, but it doesn't tend to spread too much naturally. The real problem is human-assisted transport. It's not so much the firewood per se. It might be, the landscaping industry that's moving whole swaths of material and stuff like that. So it's really anybody accidentally transporting the bug via hitchhiking or tainted material altogether. That's the real problem with the bug spreading around. So this map isn't meant to scare you. It's not a zombie apocalypse, but at the same time, you really get the idea of how fast this thing starts to spread. And you can see up here we've got 07, 09, 2010, and it just keeps going all over the place. But what I want you to notice you get all these isolated pockets, right, these islands. There's no way they made the jump from here to there naturally. So that means that people are inadvertently spreading this pest, and that's the real problem. We want to make sure people don't do that. So I had to stop in 2016 because the data just gets crazy, but this is the most recent information we have. All the little red dots that you see here, this is the official map created by the USDA as of April. Those are the confirmed infestations that were found in 2018 alone. So again, this was kind of Vermont not too long ago, right? Right up here where it was all grayed out. But what are the chances that we have a huge pocket of AAB there and a pocket of it here and not be in between? So that's the kind of thing we're trying to really make sure that if you're an at-risk community, that you're keeping an eye out and that you're developing the plant early. So as far as AAB Massachusetts, it was first detected out in Dalton in 2012 in Berkshire County, which is significant because that's where the largest stands of natural ash are in the entire state. Most of the trees you're going to see that are ash out in the eastern part of Massachusetts tend to be shade trees, ornamentals, trees that have been deliberately planted there. You're not going to see this huge forests of ash like you would out in the Berkshires. But slowly but surely, every single year, the more outreach I do and the more work DCR does and everybody gets the word out, people start to really perk up, especially around Arbor Day when they look at their ash trees and they're curious, and we're getting more and more reports. I was just telling Alan before the talk that our recent map has to be updated again just from last week because they just confirmed EAB in Wellesley. So it's almost a matter of people who learn about it, once they go look, they confirm that it's been there longer than actually suspected. But in 2017, just last year, we just confirmed Norfolk County, so it's getting there. This is the most recent infestation, and this was something that was confirmed in Belchertown before we had this talk and decided to put this talk together, so I'm glad that Henry was so gracious in helping to organize this, because again, as we see, we've got Amherst right here, and we've got Belchertown right next door, and that's just a hop, skip, and throw away of where we've got EAB. So where exactly is it in relation to where we are? This is Town Hall, more or less where we're at the moment, and then this is where the very first infestation was, and then of course you've got Mount Holyoke Range State Park, and I always like to point that out. You've got the quagga in the area here. If there are significant ash trees in that area that have any value, maybe they were commercial value, who knows, might be. It's something that the officials in that area want to definitely have a conversation over. So you want to get an idea of just how close in proximity that is. And it really isn't too far. So a little about the ecology of emerald ash borer. Nothing too crazy, but just to learn about it. It does lay its eggs early on, now in May. They're these tiny little eggs that's laid behind the bark. And that's different than Asian longhorn beetle that will chew an egg-laying site and lay one egg dead in the center. As the eggs hatch, they will start to burrow inside the bark, right beneath it, into what's called a cambium layer. This is very important to distinguish because Asian longhorn beetle will burrow right through the center of the tree, right through the heartwood, and just continue its life cycle munching away through the entire thing. Versus ALB, one of the reasons it's so effective at killing trees lightning fast, 2 to 3 years, which again in tree years is a blink of an eye, is because it targets the cambium layer, which is the vascular system right beneath the bark. And that's basically how the tree gets all its nutrients. So it essentially starves the tree quite rapidly. And this is the real problem. The pupae themselves, they start to pupate over winter, and then the adults will emerge in May through June. So our flight season is starting up right now, is where we start to really see them flying around. And then you see the little tiny beetles. Important things to note, typically you won't really see a lot of larvae unless you are dealing with a really heavy infestation, and you almost never will see a live beetle. The beetles themselves tend to feed up in the canopy, they feed on the foliage of the tree. That doesn't cause any significant damage itself. It's really the larvae that are the main problems. Those are the ones that will cause so much damage that the tree itself will start to die off and decline. So, like I mentioned, the beetle itself has got that iridescence to it. It's shiny, shiny green. That's why it's called the emerald ash borer, part of the Rhesidae family. We have our own native proboscideans in Massachusetts, which are, of course, not invasive. They're native. They don't cause any harm at all. So if you ever did find a proboscid beetle that looks similar to this, it's tiny, and you wanted to absolutely be sure that it's emerald ash borer, one of the things you could do is take a pin or anything like that and just lift up the elytra, which are also known as the wing covers, and you want to look for that coppery purple kind of red, reddish-blue underwing, and that's one of the most effective ways of determining whether or not what you're dealing with is in fact emerald ash borer. But again, have to stress, very unlikely that you would ever actually see an adult beetle. Now, this is something that I've always considered taking off this presentation, and I'll tell you why. The larvae, yes, they're gross. Everything's gross as far as a larval insect. But the real point here is that it takes trained entomologists with DNA samples to really be 100% positive that what you're dealing with larva is a specific species. Larvae can vary, they can be generic looking, they really do have a lot of distinction, so you want to be sure that if you're seeing larvae or any of these things, you want to piece things together, and that's really, really important. So if you suspect you have emerald ash borer, you want to have a bunch of different clues that lead to the larger picture instead of just saying, ah, I saw this one worm in a tree, it's got to be emerald ash borer. There's a progression of steps you want to basically take. So the very first step, and this is so important, is you want to be able to identify an ash tree. Because I would much rather, 1,000 times over, have somebody write me a passionate email with photos and everything and have it turn out to be a pine tree than have that person not write me at all and then suspect it's something. So the very first thing you want to do is just know what an ash tree looks like. You want to be able to identify the bark, the simosa of seeds, the opposite branching, compound leaves, things like that. You'll notice that, of course, it's all ash. It's not just one or another. Not mountain ash, Sorbus americanus, not a true ash tree. But there is this one example down here of fringe tree. That is based off one documented case down in Florida where emerald ash borer was found in a tree. It's not ash. It's not fully understood why that was, but they were able to confirm that EAB was able to complete its life cycle on a fringe tree, which is an ornamental tree down south. And again, there's one instance of that ever happening, so I don't want to raise any alarm bells that all of a sudden they're going to jump to our maples or anything like that. But just for the sake of being incorporated on my basis, I definitely want to make sure I include that as well. So now that we know it's an ash tree, we're absolutely positive. We've really narrowed that down. We want to start finding out the kind of damage we're looking at. So best case scenario, absolute ideal, you've got the serpentine S galleries, right? You'll notice that they start narrow and they get wider as they go. It's not always that exact same shape, mind you. When you're peeling off the bark, you start to see this. You can tell it's all over the place. It's not really perfectly S-shaped the entire time, but they do follow that progression. You can see them over here. And then, of course, they're all full with what we call frass, also known as beetle poop. So that's the first step. Ash tree, now we see the bark peeling off. We're looking for all these galleries, all these larval galleries. The second thing is you want to look for the D-shaped exit holes. So they are tiny. I did bring some wood samples over here for you guys to see after the talk. You can just check them out personally. And I will also stress that they're not always perfectly D-shaped. It's not always going to be ideal, but typically on a tree with a lot of EAP, you will find a good variety of these. And again, I have a little piece of wood so you can see the true size. But they're unlike the exit holes of the Asian longhorn beetle, which are perfectly round. And if you took a number 2 pencil and stuck it inside of it, it would go straight in the back, as opposed to these guys, which are quite tiny and they can't fit anything inside of them. So this is another great indicator or sign to look for if you suspect you've got emerald ash borer. This is what they call woodpecker blonding. So because the larva is right underneath the bark, it's really attractive to woodpeckers. They can access them quite easily. And they basically go on a feeding frenzy if there's enough larvae there, and then just start stripping away the outer bark of all these ash trees to the point where you create this blonding effect that's easily recognizable. So again, we're starting to piece this picture together by looking at all these things, and it's not to say that one infestation or one tree is going to have all of these together, but if you start to see D-shaped exit holes, some blonding, the bark peeling away, that's a pretty good indicator that we're dealing with emerald ash borer. In case anybody was wondering, they have done numerous studies whether or not the woodpecker population would be able to suppress EAB. And it's been somewhat inconclusive, but it's showing more and more likely. Like, obviously if woodpeckers had been able to keep the numbers down, we wouldn't have seen that natural spread. So they definitely do help a little bit, but I wouldn't say they keep the numbers down enough. So now the tree has gone through a pretty bad infestation, and it's really starting to show signs of damage. Important to note that, as we all know, ash is an incredibly susceptible species to a variety of things. We've seen ash in decline that doesn't necessarily have to do with EAB. There's ash yellows, there's drought that really stresses the tree. But it becomes this feedback loop where the more stressed the tree is, the more volatiles it's put down the atmosphere, and the bugs are really becoming attracted to it. So it becomes this magnet for all the EAB. And the first thing you're going to start to see is when the trees start to die is the canopy dieback, the very, very top. And now what's happening is that it can't photosynthesize. It really can't get the nutrients it needs. So as a last resort, they start shooting out these epicormic shoots at the trunk. And it's trying to really save itself from starving, essentially, because again, it cannot really get the nutrients it would normally get from the very top here. So canopy dieback, one of the best ways of indicating that, and see the epicormic shoots, again, another great indicator of AAB. But, like I mentioned before, my goal isn't to really create any alarmist state where people see an ash tree and they go, oh my gosh, it has to be AB. There are a lot of native insects that really do their part in maintaining the ecosystem services that we would want them to, that we wouldn't want to mistake with emerald ash borer. So, again, it's really important that we piece all those things together so we can eliminate some of these options. For example, we've got the banded ash borer, which some people would see an ash tree, they would see galleries like this and would suspect it might be AB. We also have the ash lilac borer. And I've seen a couple of trees that come to me with reports of this being the case and not being AB, but again, much rather have that information. So, the point being, there are other insects out there that definitely do feed on ash trees that have their own set of characteristics that you can differentiate between E and B. But it's important to know that because not every hole in an ash tree is going to always be EAB.
So, do you have something to help us identify the different bugs? Or?
So, I have those indicators I mentioned before, so how you can differentiate EAB. I can definitely pass more information about the, well, not so much the lookalikes, but the lookalike damage. But having all those things that we talk about together should typically indicate one way or the other, allow you to eliminate the other options. So we talked about how the ash that we see most in the eastern part of the state, I think eastern because I'm out in the eastern part, you guys are right around here, gets a little bit thin, but then you see it starts to really get rather dense out in Berkshire County and a couple more pockets over here. Along the Connecticut River Valley, you've got a lot of ash. Ash trees are a riparian genus, so they typically like to live along water, stuff like that. Something to keep in mind. But as I mentioned earlier, apart from all the great value the tree provides, the trees have a natural right to exist. So yes, the trees provide great lumber. You know, yes, the best baseball bats come from ash trees, and they have cultural significance because Native Americans would use black ash for basket weaving, and you know, there really is practical uses of the trees themselves. But the real issue, especially for communities, urban communities, is safety, right? As EAB starts to feed on this tree, in as little as a year or two, it might not look like it's a severe decline, but it might be brittle to the point where it's now a safety hazard, and that's a real problem, because if a tree isn't showing signs of severe damage, and it is really potentially going to suffer massive catastrophic failure, that's something you want to be aware of, right? So that's the number one issue I really try to strive to bring home, because if you have an ash tree, it's over power lines or over a really busy intersection that people just haven't been noticing, that's the one you really want to start paying attention to. So this is a picture that really was a wake-up call for the city of Worcester, because they had just discovered Asian longhorn beetle, and then a few, I believe it was months later, they had this giant ice storm where they didn't realize this whole strip of trees had been heavily infested, and now they've all come down at once. And that's a problem for a number of reasons. Not only because it's that a huge eyesore and you've lost all these trees, but it's a huge strain on the city's budget to eliminate all those trees at once, which are now much more expensive because they're safety hazards, as opposed to they selectively culled them and taken them down when they were a little bit safer. And again, this is when the federal government, the state government, and the city of Worcester really spurred to action and started developing plans as far as ALB, and that's kind of what we want to avoid with anything like that. That's not to say that we have whole strips of ash trees along one road here, but who's to say that we don't, or that there might not be one particular area. So it's not about having ash trees fall that only affects residential homes, but it's also utility companies, you know, Eversource and all these big electrical companies. They have certified arborists and foresters on staff because it's more cost efficient for them to go out and assess the trees over their power lines than to have to just, you know, re-up these lines every time the trees come down. So they are really thinking about the effect that emerald ash borer has as far as their industry goes. So now that we know what the problem is, I want to know what's being done. And the very first thing that's being done from the federal government is a quarantine zone. And that seems like somewhat of a relief. You know, nobody's moving ash outside of the quarantine zone into areas where there shouldn't be. But we all see these pockets here, so we know it's getting there somewhere. And apart from there being a federal quarantine, I'd like to ask when the last time a state police officer pulled you over and checked for ash in your back seat. You know, the reality is that it's not happening. It comes down to people being educated, informed, and making the right decisions. So it's really, really nice to see this yellow beetle, by the way, just in case, touch on that really lightly, is that it's mind-boggling for me to think about eradicating a bug from existence in any given area. But that's what they're doing, and it's actually working. They haven't moved the quarantine zone in 5 years, and they haven't found any live beetles in the traps, and I think the last 2, they're constantly monitoring things. But keep that in mind in relation to EAB, because EAB is so far gone and so spread that there is nothing the federal government is doing really, apart from enacting that quarantine zone, to assist local communities. It all falls on the towns and the cities themselves to decide whether or not they want to take action. My job isn't here to twist anybody's arm and say, hey, you have to do this to protect your city. It's really just to make sure that you feel like you're prepared and you have the right resources, the right information to take action should you choose. The do-nothing approach is very much an option. I would just hope that within the parameters that are allowed, that some people would choose alternates. So what's being done as far as in the state level? DCR, the Forest Health Program, is doing a great job of monitoring. They have a lot of traps that they set up. They do girdling for both population sinks and for monitoring themselves. This is great because what I do for the state, I will take in all the reports as they come in, and then I'll do assessments. I would much rather, like I said, have somebody give me wrong information and have it be nothing near EAB than have somebody say, no, it's definitely not. One of the things that is a challenge for me as an outreach person doing this for a while is it's gotten to the point where I don't even fight with them anymore, but I've had people just come up to me at the events like the Amherst Sustainability Festival, and they're just so adamant that they have Asian longhorn beetle in their backyards, and they know they have it, or emerald ash borer. They're convinced, and no matter what information I present to them, they can't be convinced otherwise. And then what always frustrates to me is, if you're so positive that you have this invasive insect, that you know is incredibly damaging, and you know that it's a problem, why didn't you report it? Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you do anything, right? So reporting is really the key, and making sure people understand what they should be reporting is how we save ourselves from people just getting flooded with all these different reports. And then of course there's biosurveillance, which is where I come in. We talked about this earlier, and I brought these little booklets here for anybody who might be interested, which I think are really cool. Favorite part of my job, unquestionably, I get paid to go outside and play with bugs. If you don't really understand how this project works, it's very, very simple. We have our own progressive beetles in Massachusetts that are not invasive, they're natives. And we have this little tiny wasp that doesn't sting. It's called Cerceris shrubipennus, which targets the exact same family of beetles that EAB belongs to. It can't distinguish between the natives and the invasives. So when it goes out to hunt for these beetles, if it finds requested, it's going to catch it. And what I do is I stand at this colony, because they burrow in the typically ball fields, and I do one of two things. Number one, I will catch the beetle as they fly in with the net, and I will intercept the beetle, put it in a little vial, and then ID that to see if it's EAB. This is how we monitor for EAB in the area. We confirmed 2 towns last summer, Georgetown and Waltham, using this method, and it's really, really fun to get citizen science out there and scouts. But it's a great little program, and again, I think it's really, really effective. This is how I've seen adult EAB, because I've had the fortune of having the wasps themselves delivered to me. So these are pictures from my season this year. You notice that the other alternative to catching the beetles with the nets, the wasps with the nets I mentioned, is what they call discards. So it's not fully understood why, but often the wasp will paralyze the beetles, bring them all the way back to the nest, and then just leave them right outside. You've got one here, one here, one here. You've got one over here, and then of course, boom, an EAB right there. How many of you guys notice the size of the beetle in relation to the wasp? They're pretty big, right? So when you see them flying, they're really like carrying this thing, and it's kind of funny because they're just trying so hard to get it back to the nest, and they're really clumsy, but you just swoop them up with the net and take them away. But again, really, really effective way. If there was any ball fields, or if there was any interest in getting people out there, Connecticut, for example, the Master Gardens program there has got an incredible volunteer base. I mean, they've got dozens of people scoring the state, and they're just catching wasps all day, looking for beetles, and it's a great way to, like I said, get people out there engaging in science, which I really love. So this is stuff that communities can do, right? There is insecticide treatments that definitely can be applied if you wanted to preserve any trees. There's the girdling of trees for population sinks, which means basically you strip the bark of a tree, which is going to kill it, but before it dies, it's just screaming for help, and that's putting all these volatiles, which again is a magnet for the beetles. All the beetles come, they lay their eggs on there, and then they destroy the tree, effectively killing all the beetles that would have emerged out of that. And then of course there's biocontrol. Anybody here know exactly what biocontrol is? So for those of us that may not know, biocontrol is really kind of fascinating. It's fighting fire with fire. It's basically taking parasitoid insects from the native range of EAB that predate specifically and kill EAB. Of course, that sounds scary because you don't want to introduce something else already introduced, so they do years and years of research to make sure it's species specific, but there are a couple species, so like that's what DCR does it. But the hope is that in the future, if we get enough of these wasp populations established, and they are tiny, they will do something to hopefully keep the numbers of EAB from spreading too much. But for me, it all starts with what we're doing today. It all starts with education and outreach, making sure that people are informed. So that's a really simple, straightforward approach, right? And again, this is you as a shade tree community.